This is the story of Brigid and the Cailleach as told by Don Casey, and it goes something a little bit like this. So long, long ago lived the Cailleach, the old one, the cold one, the old woman of winter. Her face was blue and her teeth were tusks, her hair was white as frost. And in those long ago days the Cailleach tramped the lands with her staff in her hand and her creel, her basket, on her back, full of stones and rocks. She dropped down the rocks and they went tumbling to the earth, crashing and splashing onto the land and into the sea. That is how she made the hills and the mountains, the highlands and the islands. The Cailleach lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, for she knew where to find the water of life, in the well of youth. Whenever she grew weary, she would tuck up her skirt and wade into the ocean. The sea was nothing to her. It came up only to her knees. She would go to the island of the west, the island of the blessed, and there stood the well of youth. In the morning, at sunrise, the Cailleach lifted off the great stone slab which covered the well. She cupped her hands and drank the cold, clear water, and was revived. The smell of the lid of the well had to be replaced before nightfall to preserve the precious waters. So, at sunset, the Cailleach laid the stone slab back over the well. After the mountains were made, the Cailleach took her plaid, her great shawl, to the swirling whirlpool of Corryvreckan. She threw in her shawl and tramped it with her feet until the booming of the waves could be heard miles around. And when her shawl was washed, she laid it on the mountains to dry, and the land was covered with snow. The old woman of winter roamed her white world, with her staff of blackthorn in her hand. Wherever her staff struck the ground, the earth was frozen cold and hard as iron. She went wandering through her mountains, followed by herds of red deer, for she was the guardian of the wild beasts, the horned herds of goats, the wolves and the eagles. She could even take the form of a wild bird herself, a great grey heron. For a long time, the world was gripped by winter, but in the belly of the earth something tiny was glowing. Something tiny was beginning to grow. The spirit of spring was quickening, and on the surface of the earth, in sheltered spots, grew green. One day the sun came out and a flower opened, but still the Cailleach tramped the land. Her ice breath dashed the flimsy petals and her black staff snapped the tender stem. The Cailleach laughed, and her laugh was bitter, stinging wind. Then she put her fingers to her lips and she whistled. She whistled up the winds, her wild winter wolf winds. From high on the mountain tops they came, from far in the northlands they came. The Fedak, the Gobak, the Squabak and the Garran. The shrill wind, the sharp wind, the sweeper and the shrieker. Yowling and howling they came, over the forest, over the seas, whipping up waves, lashing down trees. Branches were torn from the trunks, rivers rose in flood, and the Cailleach laughed out loud. She kicked up her skirts and hurled down her hail. She danced in the storm like a child in the rain. But when at last the winds died down, the hail melted. The Cailleach sighed. She rubbed her back, her stones ached, her knees creaked. She was exhausted. She sat staring out to sea and she sang to herself a sad, sorrowful song. Oh, I am weary and old, all alone in the dark and the cold, when the cold winds blow, when the cold winds blow. Once again, the Cailleach hitched up her skirt and waded through the cold ocean to the well of youth. She lifted the great stone slab and drank a little. Then the Cailleach saw a soft mossy spot and she sat down there just to take the weight off her feet for a moment. The Cailleach closed her eyes just for a little rest. But before the Cailleach awoke, before she had a chance to replace the capstone, the sun set and the moon rose. And as the moon rose, with it rose the waters of the well, higher and higher until the waters touched the lip of the well, and still the Cailleach slept. And still the waters rose, tipping over the lip of the well, slipping and spilling over the edge. Swelling and swirling, urging and surging, rising and roaring, a great wave of water curled and crashed over the sleeping Cailleach. As the waters washed over her plaid, her cloak, it began to melt and trickle away into the earth. As the waters washed over her hands, her grip loosened, and her staff of blackthorn rolled out of her fingers and away down the hill, where it lodged beneath a holly bush. As the waters of life washed over the great shape of the sleeping Cailleach, she herself was turned into a great grey stone. For this is what happens to old Cailleachs at the end of their days. The full moon shone on that old cold boulder of stone. Well water fell like the first spring rain. The moon set and all was still. There was an opening in the hill, and the sun rose. The opening was lit with light, like a flame blazing. And as the sun rose higher, bathing the land in a new light, a new woman emerged. Her dress was white, her cloak was green, her hair was red as fire. This was Brigid coming to power. Brigid the bright, Brigid the white, Brigid the bringer of spring. Now, some say that the Cailleach still sleeps, her stone cold sleep, and that Brigid stays only until summer's end, and then again the Cailleach will wake. But some believe that Brigid is the Cailleach herself, transformed like a great clay glacier that changes into a bright, bubbling spring. Brigid had the power of fire within her. The spark of poetry tingled on her tongue. As she walked, she sang, and her song was soft as a spring breeze and bright as a bird song. The heat of healing and the warmth of crafting were in her hands. She knelt and dipped her finger in the frozen river, and though it was cold, it began to flow. She reached out and picked up the staff of blackthorn from beneath the holly tree, and as she held it in her hand, it began to swell and sprout, and the black wood turned white with blossom. Brigid looked out over the bare, brown earth, and she took off her cloak, her mantle of green. Lovingly, she laid it over the land. And Brigid, Brigid the white, Brigid the bright, walked out into her green world. Like a dancing flame, she moved over the land, and everywhere she walked, the snowdrops flowered in her footsteps. A gentle breeze whispered, "Spring is coming." A brook murmured, "Spring is coming." A bird sang, "Spring is coming." And so it was, and so it is. So that's the story of Brigid and the Cailleach, as told by Dawn Casey in her wonderful book Winter Tales.